Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsay, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of SuperPsyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. SuperPsyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. There is a measure that can relate directly to a company's growth. It's also one of the biggest predictors of the functioning of a couple, an athletic team, even political discourse. What could this amazing measure be? Psychological safety. Harvard Business School professor and researcher Dr. Amy Edmondson, who was a guest on SuperPsyched in 2024, is the person who coined the term, and it has real staying power. I have seen how it plays out in companies and in my consultation room. When I learned that Minette Norman, a person I hold in the highest regard, had co-authored a book on psychological safety with Carolyn Helbig, I knew I needed to share her with you. Minette is an award-winning author, speaker, and leadership consultant with decades of experience as a Silicon Valley leader, and she brings all of that to her book, The Psychological Safety Playbook for Changemakers. A quick read packed with user-friendly, game-changing insights and tips. I love the book, and I'm not alone. Amy Edmondson and Danielle Pink both praised the book, and I'm confident you'll understand why. So listen in as Minette and I explore how to embed the magic of psychological safety at work and at home so you can foster more trust, creativity, and honest conversation in every part of your life. Minette Norman, welcome to SuperPsyched.
Oh, Adam, I'm so happy to be with you today.
You know, just listener, Minette is one of these people with whom I speak for the very first time on the phone. And immediately there is just such a profound kinship. And I can think of nobody better to have written the psychological playbook for Changemakers. She's got the chops. She lives and breathes psychological safety. I immediately felt psychologically safe with you and just felt like telling you everything because you just have that vibe about you. And if I were to say that there is one key factor that is the biggest change maker in just about any operation, organization, business, or even personal relationship, it would be this factor known as psychological safety, for which you and I are both profoundly indebted to Dr. Amy Edmondson out of Harvard Business School for coming up with the whole research around the topic. Let's just kind of geek out though for a second. You collaborated on this book with someone overseas, and to do something like that in and of itself requires psychological safety. I'm wondering, first off, what is psychological safety and how might it have even played in your collaboration in creating this book?
All right. Quick definition of psychological safety is that in a group you're a part of, you believe that you can ask a question, you can make a mistake, you can share your viewpoint, even if it differs from everyone else in the group. And you know that you're not going to be marginalized, you're not going to be embarrassed, you're not going to be excluded, and you're not going to have negative repercussions for doing any of those things. It's very much a phenomenon in groups. And we, as human beings, and you know, as a psychologist, you know this, you feel it viscerally when you have it and when you don't. When you have it, it's incredibly freeing. It's incredibly energizing. Groups that I've been a part of with high psychological safety, everyone's contributing and they're also listening to one another. You can debate openly and not get hurt feelings because you're debating the ideas. It's not personal. And it feels like we are doing our best work together. We are truly tapping into the creative genius of this group. And the opposite we feel, and honestly, it's way more common than high psychological safety. I worked in tech for 30 years. I sat in so many groups where the leader of the group or the most senior person in the room would say, okay, this is what we're doing. What do you all think? Everyone would say, great idea. Everyone would smile. Everyone would nod. You'd leave the room. You'd leave Zoom. And then there's the meeting after the meeting and everyone says, oh, come on, that's never going to work. That's ridiculous. But you don't feel safe to share that in the room. That's when there's low.
It's the emperor's new clothes.
Yeah.
We are going to go out on that parade float naked because everybody was afraid to say, wear some damn clothes.
to your point about Amy Edmondson and her research, there's been so much research about the need for psychological safety in really high stakes environments like healthcare, where she did so much of her research when people don't speak up, like a nurse sees something, but they don't want to challenge the surgeon, for example, lives are at stake. Or the spaceship Challenger that blew up. That was a case study in low psychological safety when the engineers knew there was a problem, but they were shut down. Their voice was not welcome. And there were lives lost. And so it's not just, the one thing I always try to dispel this myth of, it's like this nice to have, touchy feely. No, it is really often life or death, or business results or not, or innovation or not, if we have psychological safety or not. So that's what it is.
I love how you've defined it. And I would just elaborate by simply saying, in my experience, romantic relationships thrive when there is psychological safety as well. And they tend to really flail when there is the absence of it. So it's very important on the micro and the macro levels.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned romantic relationships. Carolyn and I, who I'll talk about, when we wrote our first book and now the new one, we really had the audience in mind of business professionals and leaders and teams. But so many of our readers have said, I apply all of these things in my personal life and my family life and my romantic life. My friendships are better because of it. So it's funny, we thought of it as narrowly for business, but to your point, it matters in all of our life.
Absolutely. So here you are, and we're getting a little meta here. You and Carolyn write this great book, by the way, a delightful read. How did psychological safety play a role in the creation of this book?
It's kind of a story I need to take back to 2021. So in 2021, I signed up for a class. It was a class based on Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety, and it was how to run psychological safety assessments based on her 7-question survey that she developed. And in that class was Carolyn Helbig, this woman who's also a leadership consultant and a PhD in human biology, who lives in Bonn, Germany. And she and I, kind of like you and I, Adam, we just hit it off when we were in that class. We totally connected. We were in a small cohort within the big class, and everything resonated when we spoke. And then what happened was I was on a podcast with another student in the class. And in the podcast, I said, I am so frustrated because I can only find research about psychological safety. I can't find anything practical. And I work with leaders and teams, and I want practical steps to increase psychological safety. And Carolyn heard me on the podcast, and she sent me an email. And I think here was her first moment of psychological safety. The email subject line was crazy idea. And she said, Minette, I heard you on the podcast. You and I are really aligned. I'm super frustrated. I'm looking for this. You're looking for it. We can't find it. It doesn't exist. What if we put together our basically 50 years of collective experience and our hearts and our minds, and we wrote something? That's where it started. And we initially thought we would write like a pamphlet or a brochure that we would give out to our clients. And so we basically got on a Zoom call, and she set up a Miro board, like an online whiteboard where we could brainstorm. And honestly, every year we have to create a new whiteboard because we keep working together every year. But anyway, that's where it all started. Brainstorming, silent brainstorming, and then drafting. And this is where psychological safety really comes into our work, is that even from the beginning, we treated it very playfully. This idea of writing something is like, what if? It was about possibilities. What if we tried? What if we did something, rather than getting bogged down in, we're going to write a best-selling book? No, it was like, let's write something for our clients that then emerged into something bigger. And then we were introduced to Page 2 and they wanted to publish it. And so it was all this like, what if we tried? What if we experimented? The way we first worked on the Psychological Safety Playbook with the subtitle Lead More Powerfully by Being More Human was our first book. When we worked on that book, we kind of divided up the chapters, and we would each draft a chapter and then the other would review it. And this is where I think both of us realized, like, this is such an act of vulnerability when you share your shitty first draft with someone else, right? And we just, from day one, would not say like, this is terrible and big red pen, but instead like, let's see if we could enhance this or clarify this. So we have been like that now for 5 years. I feel like we embody all the things we talk about in our work, in the way we work together, in giving constructive feedback in a way that is loving. I would say loving, really, because it's like, we love this work, we're dedicated to this work, and we just want it to be better. And it never feels like an attack, and we can say anything. And, we wrote that whole first book, Adam, never having met face-to-face. We didn't meet until the book came out in February 2023, and we met in July of that year.
What a great story, and what a testament to the power of psychological safety that can go through Zoom. The fact is, we can feel it if it's there. And I was in a company where the leaders were trying to basically fake it during, a sales conference, like during certain operations. And it was like, we could not really play. It was like playing with Nerf guns, except for the fact that they were armed with arrows.
Loaded.
Yeah. So it's like, no, not happening. Another thought that I have is just very similarly, one of the costs of writing a book is, as you described it, the shitty first draft. Brene Brown calls it simply the SFD.
SFD, yeah, we love that.
And I love that. And I remember being done with my book, ostensibly finished. And I announced to my wife that I'd finished it. I said, I finished it, but I hate it. And she said, well, read it to me. And she said, well, honey, you hate it because you're writing the way you write. You're not writing the way you speak. I know the way you speak. Let me help you tune the book to your voice in how you speak. And there was enough safety in every intervention she threw my way by tweaking a sentence, by saying, that's not how you'd say it. This is how you say it, blah, blah, blah. This went on for 300 pages. And there's a lot of psychological safety, and my book is infinitely better for it. So you and Carolyn had this, because the fact of the matter is the shitty first draft is necessary. It's got the platform, it's got the soil that will help grow the flowers. So fantastic. I love that so much. Now let's talk about what psychological safety is not, lest people walk away thinking, oh, that means I can just call it like it is and just dump on you. What is not psychological safety, for example, those two things?
Totally. And in fact, one of the things I've actually, when I've done these presentations, it's in some, especially in certain environments like tech, where I worked for so many years, I say just explicitly, it is not an excuse to be a jerk. So let's just be explicit about that. Like, no assholes, no jerk. It is not permission to say anything, right? And one of the things that I think is really important, that if you want to create and sustain, because it's not just a matter of like, we're going to create a certain level of psychological safety and then it will be there forever, is that how do we sustain it? Well, it's how we show up every day. And those moments of like, okay, I'm going to say anything that's on my mind. Adam, I really hate your outfit. You look terrible, right? How is that going to contribute to psychological safety? In one way, it's kind of like if you go to Kim Scott's work on radical candor. When I first heard that term, I really disliked it because I thought it meant permission to be a jerk. But if you dig into her work, it's really about care, giving feedback because you care about the person and about the work. And psychological safety, it's the same thing. We have to constantly invest in this environment where, yes, people can share their ideas. Yes, they can speak up in an environment of mutual respect. That's the only way we're going to be able to continue going forward. Because if we're regular, like being rude to one another, shutting down one another, then we're basically ending the psychological safety. So it's not anything goes. And, another person's work who I really like and who we reference in our new book, Susan David, she talks about like, it's not Susan David's work, right?
It's like everything she throws down is pure gold.
Exactly. And we have a quote from her, which I don't remember exactly, but it's like, she's in favor of like labeling emotions. And I think that's really useful to get in touch with what's going on and why am I so triggered, for example. But that doesn't mean you're going to share everything with everyone. It's like, how can you be genuinely the best version of yourself? So not just genuine, which may be that I'm a jerk sometimes, but I'm true to myself. I'm going to be Minette. And I'm going to be the best version of Minette, even in a moment when I'm triggered. How would I feel proud of how I handled this moment?
When I think about the greatest TV shows ever, so many of them come from Bill Lawrence. He created Scrubs. He created, very famously, Ted Lasso. More recently, he's created The Rooster and Shrinking. This guy, it's almost like his career is just getting started, even though he's well over 30 years deep into it. He embodies psychological safety, and he has a no asshole policy.
Yeah.
If somebody's an asshole on the cast, they're out, period. No exceptions. But the funny thing is, if you look at Ted Lasso, and I've spoken with one of the most respected thought leaders on good apologies, and she said that Ted Lasso does it best, that they really nail good apologies. And if you think about Scrubs, people are interns in medicine. And you see the psychological safety. You see people fall on their face and you see their colleagues support them and prop them back up, encourage them to try again. And it's not data dumping. It's not oversharing, but it is what you were talking about. It is that ability to really be human with one another, accept mistakes, see the person and cheer them on. What I would say would be a part of psychological safety. Not everything that you've just said, but it's just so crucial. And I think about the costs of the absence of psychological safety. There seems to be a huge correlation between a company's innovative capacities and their psychological safety. What are the costs?
Innovation, you nailed it, is one of them. I mean, and when you think about it, it makes total sense. So I've experienced this. Innovation is a group activity, right? I mean, we just know that the best ideas do not just come from one person, but they come from people coming together, throwing all the ideas out there, debating them, and then developing the best solution. And innovation requires those crazy ideas. Like if you're really not going to have just incremental change, but true innovation, you need someone to say, I have an idea that is like nothing we've ever done before. And your ability to put it out there without people rolling their eyes, shutting you down, or like, yeah, that's never going to work, or yeah, we tried that one time. That shuts it down. And it stops the exploration. And exploration is required for innovation. So that's like number one is innovation. It's so obviously correlated to lack of psychological safety. And when you think about organizations today in this like incredibly disruptive time we're living through, if you're not innovating, you're going to lose out, right? So innovation, but it goes so much deeper than just innovation. It goes to performance. Like, are our staff members, employees, colleagues able to meet their goals and do their best work? And when you don't have it, and this is where, I'd love to geek out with you from a psychology perspective, but what I know is that when you don't have it, you're so worried about managing your image all the time. Dare I say this? When am I going to be silent? When am I going to speak up? Am I going to fit in with the group, or am I going to be considered an outsider? There's a whole tax on you because of low psychological safety. So your ability to do great work is diminished, because you're managing all this other cognitive and emotional burden that is on you from low psychological safety. And as a result, not only does performance go down, but then burnout goes up, employee engagement goes down, because people are just like, I don't matter here. People don't want to hear from me. So I check out. I kind of, a few years ago, it was called quiet quitting, but it's basically, I'm just doing the minimum. I'm going to coast on by here. I'm not going to speak up. I'm not going to challenge, and I'm just going to stay under the radar. And no one's doing their best work then. So, the costs have a really big ripple effect. And then, as you know, as I mentioned earlier, there can be huge costs to risk. If someone sees a problem like those O-rings on this Challenger, then no one spoke up about them, or they didn't feel they were welcome. So then lives are lost. Or in an operating room, a sponge is left in a patient and someone says, I'm not going to say anything. I think that doesn't happen much. But, there's moments where I don't dare say anything to this surgeon because he's going to bite my head off. And in the workplaces where I worked, it's a little less life and death when I was in the tech industry, but it would be everyone's supposedly agreeing. And I remember, this is how I got interested in psychological safety. I remember being the VP in the room who didn't agree with the rest of the group. And I would say, we are not talking about the fact that we are promoting only men right now. I remember bringing this up. Did you notice that everyone getting promoted is a man? And what about the women who are potentially in this role? And then just getting like shamed for that, like, oh, Minette, you're coming at this from this politically correct perspective, and there are reasons for that. Am I going to bring it up again? It's pretty exhausting, right? To keep being that only voice. So it takes a personal toll, but it takes a toll on the organization, because there's a good percentage of your group that is not living up to their potential.
It's such an interesting point around the idea of shame. Shame, we now know, and thank you once again, Brené Brown, who has given so much to the field. But the idea that we kind of turtle in the face of shame, it causes us to conceal ourselves rather than reveal ourselves. And to think that you were shamed for bringing this up, it'd be one thing if they said, well, actually, we've done performance reviews and the people that you've mentioned did not actually make the cut. Let's see if we can prop them up next year. That would be one thing. And I have a lot of difficulty imagining if that would be the case. I'd probably need to maybe re-examine the rubric, because it does seem highly suspicious. But giving those guys the benefit of the doubt, perhaps. But the idea that they would shame you for bringing it up is basically rendering you to mere tokenism and saying, I guess I'm literally only here as bling. I'm not here for my opinions. And that is horrifying to imagine. You must have just felt on some level at that moment, yeah, I guess I don't belong here.
That was just one of so many examples. And sometimes it was even less subtle than that. It would be like, I would speak and say something again that differed from the rest of the group. And there would be this kind of body language of like, there she goes again, or an eye roll. It can be a very subtle thing. And yet it's just as damaging because, again, you feel it in your gut. It's very visceral. Or someone, and again, this is another thing, is like people just ignore what you said and they just move on. You're looking around going like, did I say that out loud? Or like, what just happened here, right?
We humans have such social brains. We pick up on that immediately.
Instantly.
And if you think they're not noticing when you do that, they are, for sure. And they are probably beginning the process of quiet quitting unless there's an obvious and really conscientious repair and a mea culpa accompanying that. But boy, oh boy, not the I'm sorry if you felt, by the way.
If you felt bad.
I love that. I love that apology. I'm sorry if you felt. Yeah. It's like, oh, shut up, own it. I'm sorry that I did this and I can see that this was wrong. Here's how I intend to repair it. Is a start for an entire episode. I did one called A Good Apology with Dr. Molly Howes and just loved describing the importance of a good apology. But I'm seeing that image of you on that board as VP and just not being heard. I've sat on boards where just there were eye rolls where there was not safety and these were not innovative groups.
No, and you know what I saw a lot? And this, I think, unfortunately, I saw it the higher I went in the organization. So many people are managing their reputation.
Staying in safety, basically. Let's talk about that reputation management versus actually doing what's good for the org or the project itself. What are your thoughts on that?
So much of, unfortunately, our egos being caught up in like, how am I perceived? Like, this is a group of VPs who all report to the SVP and we all want to be favorite. This is how I saw it. And I actually talk about this in my other book on inclusive leadership. There's so much the phenomenon that I have seen of being either on the inside, so like in the inner circle versus on the periphery. And you want to be in the inner circle. Of course, you want to be the
cool kids.
The cool kids, exactly. And the cool kids exist in the corporate world just as much as it is in the playground. And
it's still high school. I don't care how old we are.
It was so high school. And often it was like the guys that were in the inner circle in my group, because there were very few women on this leadership team. But then there was like the one woman who wanted to be more like the guys and who kind of associated with the guys and not the women. And then there were the two women who banded together. I mean, I had this colleague and we were always like trying to amplify each other's voices and say like, hey, hold on a second. Maria just got interrupted. Can we let Maria speak? But everyone's just jockeying for position, jockeying for favorites. And then I always felt, unfortunately, in this group that I was on that second tier, on the outer circle. And it's lonely and it feels like there's nothing I can really do to get into that inner circle because it would be compromising my integrity. I could not be myself. And to me, the most important thing is that we keep our integrity at work. And I saw a lot of people who didn't, who really just like kissed up to whoever the senior leader was, whether or not they agreed with them or not. So that's how I saw the reputation management. And it meant that people were not truthful and that they would say things to agree and look good as opposed to what is the best thing collectively for this group.
So I'm imagining the transition from a less safe org to a far more safe org is a very difficult one. They hire you, they hire Carolyn to come in and say, help us. How do you even begin?
There's the meat of the work. Well, I mean, the invitation already is fabulous because there's some acknowledgement that we have a problem and that we want to do something about it. And, you know, one of the first things that Carolyn and I will say is that you don't have to change everything you do. It's small shifts, and we're going to tell you what a lot of them are, but you're going to have to commit to doing it every single day. Because that's the thing about psychological safety is that how we show up every single day will make or break it. It shouldn't be overwhelming, and I don't want it to be. So here's a typical intervention. Like I had a fabulous client I was introduced to. He's a superintendent of a big school district, and he had taken over as superintendent. And he said, Minette, I was a friend of his, gave him the book, and he said, I really love it. I want to work with my team. He said, here's my overarching goal. I want to bring humanity back to the workplace. I'm like, okay, this is the man I want to work with. He said the team had been through so much turmoil. They'd had like 5 superintendents. So they were feeling just completely uncertain, fearful. this is what we did together. He invited me to give a whole day workshop to his whole leadership team. So it was like 50 people. That's a big investment in time. And he was signaling to his team that he meant this. Like, we're really going to work on this. So we workshopped a whole bunch of exercises through the book. People made commitments. One of the most powerful ways you can influence psychological safety is redesign how you run meetings, because meetings is where we spend so much of our time. And meetings really reveal the culture and who has power and who has a voice and who doesn't. So how do you make sure you hear from everyone? And we had them basically draft their own meeting agreements. And then what Joe, this is the superintendent, Joe did is like, he had his assistant put time in his calendar for him to do the work that he needed to do, which was, some of it was just like informally going and chatting with people and letting them know that he was there for them and listening and letting people brainstorm with him and not punishing them. And over the course of the year, I mean, it really was a year. And I came back to several of their meetings virtually to see how things were going and what they were struggling with. And what they told me was amazing. They said, I made certain assumptions that my team was telling me the truth and that they were speaking up. I assumed they were. And this was a woman in one of the leadership positions. And she said, I took your idea from the book. And one of the ideas in the first book, which we reiterate because it's so powerful, is to just regularly ask, what am I missing? Because it's an invitation. It's an invitation of, I can't see everything. What do you see that I don't see? Or what are we missing? She said, as soon as I started regularly asking that question, I started hearing from people who never spoke up before. And I guess they needed permission. I guess they needed an invitation. And now we're getting more ideas on the table so we can solve things more quickly and not get that sort of passive resistance. And so it's work like that. It's very small things. It's not revamping your HR systems. It's like, how do I behave every single day in every interaction? How do I listen differently? How do I deal with it when I get triggered? How do I just take that pause and take that breath? And then choosing a response instead of shutting someone down and shaming them. And it's little things like that that just take practice and commitment. And this guy, Joe, Dr. Joe Morlock, he's a living and breathing example of the power of investing in this. So anyway, we featured him in our new book because he had had such a great success in investing in this.
And you intuitively answered the what am I missing question, because that is actually one of them that I'd written down. But I'm wondering, what are some other subtle cues a leader can embody to demonstrate, like Dr. Joe might, would really encourage psychological safety? What are some things that are subtle that we might overlook?
Well, I think it's not only the what am I missing, but it's also the getting away from groupthink. Groupthink is so powerful that we feel like we have to agree with one another, again, for our reputation and to stay part of this group. So actually asking for dissent, that's another really powerful thing. Like, this is something that I think is a great practice. It's like, it seems like we're all agreeing here. What if one of you would play devil's advocate for a moment? Because if they don't feel comfortable, people are still not going to be the dissenting voice. But to assign someone that role of devil's advocate, that was one of the things another leader in the same group tried. And he said it was amazing because then we could we could now start to poke holes in things and make sure we hadn't really missed something because we are just explicitly asking for dissent. And then one more thing I'll add about what leaders can do. I mean, there's so much, but really showing up with curiosity and not having all the answers. So listening, being somewhat vulnerable in I messed up as a leader. Kind of early in my leadership career, when I made a bad decision and I had to reverse it, I thought it was career limiting. I thought everyone's going to lose respect for me. And I'll never forget when I actually said, I made the decision based on limited information. When I got new information, I'm changing this decision. This is what I did. And I was so scared to share that. And what I heard was, that was so amazing that you actually admitted you'd gotten something wrong and you changed it. And I have so much respect for you. So what leaders can do is to admit where they mess up, what they're going to do differently, what they learned. And that really is contagious because then members of their organization start to feel like they don't have to be perfect. They can share their learnings and collectively the group learns instead of shames one another. So that's another very powerful shift. And it's hard for leaders because we always think we have to be perfect, right?
It's interesting as I hear you say that, I hear that leader thinking like a scientist. And Adam Grant writes about this in Think Again, my favorite read in 2022, I want to say. Just my favorite book. I actually read it twice in 1 month. I loved it so much. But he basically described the idea of being willing to be wrong is one of the primary components of being a scientist. I mean, if a better idea comes along, I mean, the Dalai Lama even says it, if a better idea comes along, we go with that idea. Even Talmudic scholars will say it doesn't matter who the idea comes from, it's the best idea that wins. Yes. And I love that idea as well. I also find myself thinking about something super important, and that is we need to have a culture in which our mistakes aren't ultimately weaponized against us. Yeah. And so that there is that safety, as you just said, to basically be able to share our warts. I remember when I was a newly minted psychologist, and the first supervisor I had just was not safe to make mistakes in front of. This was actually not a supervisor, but rather a paid consultant. And as I was kind of vetting future consultants, the next one who I did find said, "Oh, are you saying that you want to be able to show up with your whole self in the consultation room?" And I said, "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying." And he was hired, and he and I worked together for 12 years, and he was brilliant. And last but not least, one of the things I know about you, you're also the author of The Boldly Inclusive Leader. You really care about inclusivity as more than a moniker, but as this is something that drives better business. Folks wake up and smell the coffee. It's essential. Susan Cain brings it up brilliantly in her book, Quiet. And she says that very often, particularly in milieus like Harvard Business School, where the extroverts get all of the airtime and the introverts may actually have the better ideas. We need neurodiversity. We need personality diversity. We need to absolutely acid test the idea that's coming about. She said that for introverts to be able to better contribute, sometimes they need to go away from the table for a period of time and then come back to the table with their ideas. And I think that's a very important one. And I'm wondering, just kind of weaving your knowledge around inclusivity, what would be some of the ways that we could be more inclusive as we're being psychologically safe?
Well, I see them as intrinsically linked. I think that psychological safety is foundational to inclusion, and that you don't get to inclusion unless you have this bedrock. And the point you're making, and I love Susan Cain's work, and I remember when she came to speak at my last company on the book Quiet, I invited her in.
What a score.
It was really cool. We had an executive event, and I got to pick the speaker, so I picked her. And because, realistically, where I learned about introversion was leading teams of engineers, because the majority of them were introverted, and I am extroverted, and I realized they don't work the way I do. And so one of the way I invited in is this, and I learned this from someone on my team. He was brilliant. He was incredibly introverted. He was probably neurodivergent, and I don't know what label, if you wanted to label him, but he was somewhere on the spectrum. And it took me a really long time to get to know him because he was so quiet, and he had the breakthrough ideas. He had the ideas that were going to take us not like just incrementally better, but incredibly better. But to get him to share his ideas, to your point and Susan Cain's point, he needed lots of time alone before he was willing to share his ideas. So I would meet with him, and he would talk about them. And I'm like, when are you going to bring these to the group? Can we get it written down? Okay. So I had to urge him a little bit because he wanted to wait longer and we just didn't have enough time. But I gave him time, and I gave everyone time, like prepare alone, and like giving people questions in advance. And what are we going to talk about when we have our staff meeting? These are the topics. Let's have a shared document or an online whiteboard or whatever it is. And I expect you to come prepared. So set the expectations, but give people that time. Because one time I did a brainstorm in the room with my team, and one of the guys who had great ideas, I said, "Wow, you have a lot of great ideas." And he said, "If you had given this to me a couple of days ago, the ideas would have been way better. I need time alone." And that's how I learned. And so that's one of the things that Carolyn and I really recommend is like meetings don't start when you sit down at the meeting room. Meetings start when you prepare people for what you're going to talk about, when you give them time, in their own space, to reflect and cogitate and do all the things we need to do, and then bring their best stuff forward together.
Oh, I love that so much. And to that point, I was talking with Temple Grandin, who is one of the leading experts on autism. And you and I both know that some of the greatest ideas ever are going to come from somebody who is on the spectrum. Yeah. They see things differently. And this whole idea of neurodiversity and how crucial that is for a team. If you want to engage the instruments of an orchestra, the instruments need to be treated properly. And we don't expect a woodwind to sound like a percussive instrument. And similarly, she noted within the space shuttle disaster, had somebody with my neurodiversity been on that team, we would not have had some of the catastrophes. So the importance of knowing who these folks are, almost getting a user's manual for each of them, so to speak. I know we can't get an extensive one, but basically a few bullet points of like, hey, if you want to engage this person best, maybe let's know a thing or two about them. I remember my very best boss of all time, Martin Dorner, whose memory is a blessing. I miss him every day. When he came on as my new boss, back then David Letterman was on, and David Letterman's top 10, he said, listen, I'm going to give you my top 10 things that I expect from you as somebody who reports to me, but I also want your top 10 things from me so that I can serve you best as your boss. It was absolutely, what a way to start. What a way to start things. It created the best relationship ever. And I remember when I'd given, gosh, I got to share this with you, Minette. This is way too funny. I give a presentation in front of him. I was known for giving a presentation. I was known for giving it well. And he sits in the audience. He's jotting notes. I'm thinking, wow, he must be just eating this up and he's loving this. I get to my desk. Back then, there was no email. It was a memo. There were 20 points of ways that I could improve that presentation, of which 19 were correct. And I came to his office. I said, Martin, thank you so much for your feedback. I agree with 19 of these. One of them is incorrect. And he actually, eventually came to realize that one thing. But the idea that this man would take that much time to provide me with 19 ways to improve this thing that I thought I was so good at, if he had just said, great job, I would have never known. I would have been walking around basically with my fly open and not knowing it. I've always said a good friend will tell you if your fly is unzipped.
Exactly.
And you
have spinach in your teeth.
Spinach in your teeth,
exactly.
any of these things. What are some of your top tips? Like if you wanted to zhuzh it up and become far more psychologically safe in a short period of time, what would be some of the other tips that you would give teams as well as perhaps people in relationships?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, one of the things that we don't do much of is talk about the things that don't go well. We always like to talk about what's good, right? And so one of the things is like the idea of the blameless postmortem, but really to dissect when things don't go well as a way of just like, what did we learn from this and what are we going to do differently? And it's not blame or shame. It's really like, as you said, like the scientist perspective. In the laboratory, you don't expect your experiments to go well 9 times out of 10, or I don't know what the percentage is. But in our personal lives, in our work lives, it's always like no tolerance for failure. And that's just not realistic. So how can we talk about failure in a way that is safe, where we're not trying to blame and shame the other person, but instead, like, how can we talk about this objectively so that we all do better together? So that's one thing. And then I think that the thing that keeps coming back to me over and over when I work with groups and remembering my time in the corporate world is like, you really have to change how you meet. And research backs this up. In most meetings that you have, whether it's in a business setting or in a private setting or whatever, all the communities you're a part of, they're the loud people and they're the quiet people. And if you don't design things properly, the loud people will speak and the quiet people won't. And the quiet people, to your other point, may have the most important things to share, the things that will blow your mind and that you really need to know. So how do you design meetings and gatherings deliberately to hear from everyone? And maybe they're not even going to speak. Maybe they're just going to write down their ideas and we're going to put them all on the board as an inclusive way to hear all the voices.
I love that. Minette, is there anything I should have asked but haven't yet asked?
I'm sure there are so many things we could have talked about, but I guess the one thing I will say, and it's not that you should have asked it, is that it's just this kind of encouragement that people tend to get really overloaded and feeling like intimidated by the term psychological safety. And I want to just make that accessible to everyone, because everyone, no matter where you sit in a hierarchy or where you sit in a relationship, you have more control than you know. And it's really how you show up every day. So show up with curiosity, with an open mind and an open heart, and listen in new ways, and just show up in the way that you want to present as your best self to the world. And that will make a huge difference.
Love that so much. Well, that was my penultimate question. And here comes my ultimate.
Okay.
Minette, if you had the magical power to confer upon all humanity one insight or skill that would dramatically improve the lives of individuals, but since we're all connected, the people around those individuals as well, what would that insight or skill be? And how do you imagine it would improve the lives of the individuals as well as perhaps society at large.
I've heard you ask other guests that question, and I always wondered what I would say. And I never planned what I would say, but I'm going to say it now because it just keeps coming back for me. I would empower everyone to embrace the pause. And the power of the pause is not to be underestimated. When we react without pausing, we so often regret it. We say things and do things that are hurtful and damaging. And if we can all learn to take that one breath or that one sip of water before we do or say something we're going to regret, everything could be different. Because in those moments when we get triggered and get defensive, we hurt other people often, and we hurt team relationships and we hurt personal relationships. But if we pause, we can realize, okay, I'm getting triggered and I don't want to do something I regret. And now I'm going to choose to be curious or choose to just say, give me another moment. And then we can keep connected. And I think if we keep connected, both in the workplace and in the world, that changes everything. When we disconnect because we yell or we do something hurtful, that's so damaging and so pervasive. So that's what I say. If we could all learn to pause, the world would be a better place.
It's amazing what just a second can do and how difficult it is, if not impossible, to put the toothpaste back in the tube once it's been spilled. And here you are basically giving the answer on the key for the test, the pause.
You know what, Adam, I will just say one thing about that and how it can show up for you. So practically, because people say it's really hard to pause in the moment. But last week I was guest lecturing at a university class a friend of mine teaches. And one of the students asked me a question and I didn't have a great answer. And I sat there and I paused. And then I said, give me a moment, I'm thinking. And they actually reacted to that in such a positive way and said, you're actually just embodying everything you've described. You are taking a pause and you're telling us what you're doing. And we want to do that now. So it's like, you don't even have to be silent. You can pause and then you can say, give me a moment to think. And then people realize what's going on and they're with you. They're not against you.
Such an important point. And as you were saying this, and I was imagining that scene, the respect that they must have felt for you as well as the answer.
Yeah.
That you had the knowledge of yourself to say, hang on, and that you were going to not just give them something straight off the shelf, but something bespoke, something tailored to their needs. That caused their ears, I'm sure, to prick up, and they probably retained a lot more of what you said than they would have if you had just spoken off the cuff.
Exactly. So the power of the pause, Adam, that's what I'm advocating for.
As you and I are even just kind of riffing on this idea, the numbers of benefits, whether it's the quality of the answer, the way it's received, it just as a practice for yourself, there are just too many wonderful facets to observe. I'm glad that you shared that one. And I'm just so glad that you invested your heartbeats in this book. I can think of nothing more important than, quite frankly, improving psychological safety. We will have better outcomes, whether it's in business, politics, our relationships. This one thing, I believe, could be the biggest difference maker for today and for the future. So thank you, Minette.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It has been a delight to talk with you.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsay, thanking you for listening to SuperPsyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.